discussion with you all. Thank you once again for joining us in person and online, virtually as well. We had given ourselves 2 minutes before we start, and they're over. We'd like for everyone to settle so that we can begin our session for today. And our session for today, as you can see on the screen, and for those who are joining us in person, is the Afro-feminist Artificial Intelligence AI Governance, Challenges and Lessons at the IGF of 2022. We have a Zoom link. If you want, you can share with your colleagues back in your countries. It's available on the website as well. You can also be able to check out who is on the panel today on the official IGF website. And the panel session is WS#439, so that you can get additional information about everyone on the panel today. We want to request that you bear with us. We are seated on this very big panel. It's not like us, but it's so that we can be able to, I think, offer translation, and also because the microphones down here are not working very well. So we are together in spirit, although quite far from you. Feel our warmth. Then for those online, we hope you have your cups of tea ready. We hope you have your coffee, and let's have fun. If you need to share anything, yes, you see Yolanda. If you need to share anything, please share in the chat. If you feel there's something maybe we are not clear enough, please let us know in the chat, and someone will be following up and coordinating. Bridget and Yolanda, feel free to also share with us if you feel we need to repeat the question or repeat something, so that we can work together. And to officially start us off, I'd like to start us off by asking everyone in this room and everyone on the Zoom link right now. Before I introduce myself, I have an opening question for us all. How many sessions have you attended at the IGF so far, or this year, on AI, that you have seen a woman or an African woman on the panel, by a show of hands? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the Zoom link as well, I'm so happy to see that many of you attend different panel discussions, and a woman or an African woman is represented. But to set the ball rolling, I'd like to start us off with introduction. We'll start with our speakers on the Zoom link, Yolanda and, yes, we'll start with the online team, that's Bridget and Yolanda, and then we'll proceed to the in-person team who are with me here today. So Bridget, please take a few minutes to introduce yourself and your organization, and then followed with Yolanda. Karibu.
Sounds good. Hello, everyone. Once again, I see Bobina nodding, so I'm assuming everyone can hear me in the room as well. It is such a pleasure for me to be here. My name is Bridget Boachi once again, and I am the Artificial Intelligence Lead at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. I have a data science background, and I'm passionate about using technology to deliver for citizens. So it is my pleasure to have this conversation, and I look forward to sharing a bit more about what we do at the Tony Blair Institute, as well as specifically our initiative on African women in AI, as well as AI adoption on the continent in a bit. Thank you once again. Over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you to Pollicy for inviting me, and hello to everyone. It's great to be here virtually. I'm in Brussels right now because we have a conference at the European Parliament tomorrow on AI policy. I'm Yolanda Langquist. I'm Director of AI Governance at the Future Society. The Future Society is a nonprofit based in the US, incubated at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, focused on AI policy with a mission to align AI through better governance. I'm on this panel because we led the development of 3 national AI strategies in Africa, one by competitive tender with GIZ, the Fair Forward project of GIZ. GIZ is Germany's foreign development agency, and with the government ministries of the countries, which were Rwanda, Ghana, and Tunisia, and with Smart Africa. So I'll be trying to share the recommendations that we developed for those national AI strategies towards inclusive AI policy. So looking forward, and thank you so much.
And now over to our physical team here present at the IGF in Addis Ababa. We'll begin with Amber, then proceed to Quito, myself, and then Bobina will get into it. Welcome, Amber.
Thanks so much, Irene. Hi, everyone. My name is Amber Sinha. I'm here from India. I work at the intersection of law, technology, and society, and a lot of my research focuses on digital rights and the regulatory systems around them. I'm currently the Director of Research at Pollicy Data Institute, and I also serve as a Senior Fellow working on Trustworthy AI with Mozilla Foundation. Prior to this, I worked at the Center for Internet and Society in India, where until earlier this year, I was their Executive Director. So I am really looking forward to this session.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kito Shilongo. I'm part of Research ICT Africa. We're a think tank based in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm from Namibia, and I work on several projects at Research ICT Africa focused on AI, specifically just AI and data justice. I'm very interested in adapting feminist frameworks into how we conceptualize AI policies and frameworks. And I'm very excited to have this conversation and very excited to also learn from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am the moderator for today. My name is Irene Mwendwa. I am a Kenyan and I work for Pollicy, which is a Ugandan-based feminist civic tech, and I lead the strategic initiatives there. And looking forward to just learning from this panel, as well as learning from everyone. Over to you, Bobina.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bobina Zulfa, and I'm a data and digital rights researcher with Pollicy. Like my colleague said, Pollicy is a civic tech based in Kampala, but work across the region, work at the intersection of data, tech, and society. Myself, I've been working on this Afro-feminist framework for AI governance, and yeah, I'm looking forward to this session because it's a part of, I'd say, a consultancy to just get more viewpoints to add to, the work we're doing, and yeah, excited for this discussion with everyone.
Time has passed, but we'd like to give Bobina just a few minutes to speak about the Afro-feminist AI policy framework work that we've gotten into as policy, and also that encompasses everyone's contributions before we dive straight into the questions.
All right, thank you. Just very quickly, I will, so this Afro-feminist AI governance framework, one would ask themselves, I think, a couple of questions. What do you mean Afro-feminist? And then, because we know there is a number of, AI frameworks and principles that are being developed globally. However, with the work that we've been doing at Pollicy, just looking at gender and AI on the continent, there's a number of, would say gaps in terms of just structural inequalities pertaining to, AI and, African women that we felt the need to address through a framework that directly addresses a number of these gaps and issues. And so this was conceptualized off that basis, and we're doing this together with IDRC and a number of other partners. And so basically the framework proposes, puts across a number of the problems that we think pertain particularly to directly affect African women in terms of, AI development and deployment across the continent, and then just propose a number of solutions. And so it's interesting that we get out in spaces like this and get in more viewpoints to our work, contribute to our literature and, just knowledge production as a whole. And yeah, I look forward to just having more discussions with everyone here, even just outside this conversation itself. But that's a little bit about that. And it's really just to contribute to, yesterday, one of the stakeholders during the opening ceremony talked about, a UN family. And, we believe to have the, what would call global, to have a global framework, it should be representative of different perspectives from, different people and different, demographics. And we believe, the particular group, African women's voice in the AI discourse has not been represented. And so we think this is something that would be helping directly address that gap. And so, yeah, that's pretty much about this. And yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the introductions. And participants, feel free to follow Pollicy. You'll be able to get contacts of the team members you can see on stage and on the screen. And to get right into the panel of today, we are going to be discussing on issues of marginality, power, and not necessarily bias. And we'll also look at Afro-feminist AI governance. That's African women being engaged in AI governance, and also the vision of an emancipatory AI for all. And to get right into it, I'm going to address a few questions I'll start us off with Kito and Bobina, whichever order. I would like to ask you specifically, Kito, in light of a number of principles and frameworks towards ethical and responsible AI, why is there a need for multiple perspectives in addressing challenges of AI systems from across the globe? And then for you, Bobina, on intersectionality and marginality, what do you think is the role of African women in all their diversities? Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Irene, for that question. I think this is a very important question, and I just want to start off this conversation by saying that I think it's sometimes very unfortunate that often as African women and women of color and people who are marginalized and vulnerable in our societies have to come to these stages and these platforms and talk about being included. And yeah, with having said that, I think multiple perspectives are important because the principles and the frameworks that we have, or we we are drafting and developing determine how the various policy actions and policy areas are operationalized and how and which policy issues are prioritized. The first and foremost, I think if you look at the OECD principles, for instance, and many other frameworks, even the African Union Data Policy Framework, one principle that is present in all of them is creating or developing human-centered technologies that are based on human-centered values and fairness. And from an African perspective, I think we have, we're a large continent, first of all, but we also have very diverging or various values. And as from a feminist perspective, what the social values that could be that people have, for instance, in Europe, where it's more very small knit families, for instance, in communities, and we are more like larger groups. It's differing, and so when we ask ourselves what is the greater interest when we develop AI, are the interests of the people and who are the people? And so when we bring the different people to the stage, we hear their perspectives, hear their values, hear what risks they are faced from these technologies. And in developing principles, we are also able to come up with the appropriate safeguards against the risks that these technologies pose to communities. And I think protection of women, for instance, and as well as children, and as well as our concepts of what these harms are. I think, okay, what I'm trying to say is that designing technology with the appropriate safeguards requires different perspectives. And these perspectives come about when we talk to various people. And I think in Africa, for instance, what do we do when we ask ourselves, what do we do when we come into communities or in countries where our rights are not recognized as women, as queer people or LGBTQ people, where the different institutions which safeguard the rights of people living with disabilities, for instance, how do we incorporate those frameworks and those principles into the design of AI technologies? And if we conceptualize those kinds of safeguards that we need, then we're able to come up with the capacity for human intervention and oversight. And so if we say we need to protect women against gender-based violence, we've seen in Southern Africa, for instance, we've seen AI for Good technologies which are looking at gender-based violence. The way that we think about privacy and the way that we think about families is very different in Southern Africa. A lot of women who are victims of gender-based violence live with their perpetrators. They share phones. Women do not have phones, for instance, by themselves. They share phones with the people who abuse them. And if you're using an AI chatbot to, respond or provide them with assistance, how does that affect that social issue? So I think in other countries, for instance, or in other countries where more people have access to phones and don't share phones, those might work, but those kind of technologies put women at further risk. And so when we come up and say, yes, it's good that we can have technology, it's good that we can have a chatbot that can, talk to women, it's very different on the ground. And another thing is the principles of freedoms and how we perceive equality and social justice. A very important part of AI principles is how we look at the good that comes from the technologies that we are developing. And a lot of times we have to go back and think about the social justice aspects and the structural inequalities, historical inequalities that we are faced as Africans, as women, as young people as well, and incorporate that in how we design our policies or how we design our strategies, AI strategies. Secondly, the risks that are posed by AI technologies disproportionately affect certain groups, women, people living with disabilities. And so when how do we conceptualize and define harm? And the only way that we can do that, there's no one way, like what is harmful to someone else in the east of Africa is different what is harmful to someone else in the west and in the south of the continent. And so we need to have these multiple perspectives that really encompass and bring together how we define harm and not posing how we think about do no harm technologies, and proportionality as well. We've seen the kind of research that we've done. We've seen that organizations have in Southern Africa specifically have projects that they are looking at the conservation of the environment, and the overall projects have good objectives, but when you introduce technology and when you introduce AI, so if you're looking at conservation of environment, it's very non-personal and it's not related to any person. But then when you look at those technologies even deeper and the issues around that, they pose a lot of risks to the people who live in these communities. So we've seen, for instance, technologies that are tracking wildlife in Southern Africa, and it's just looking at footprints of wildlife. But in looking at how the wildlife tracks, you also are able to, in a very insidious way, surveil nomad communities like the San community. So they move around with how the animals move. And so we think about that. You wouldn't think about that, okay, what kind of risk would some technology that is tracking wildlife pose on the people around that? And it also determines how we think about how technology can impact conservation, environmental sustainability. Finally, I want to talk about the issue of sustainability. In bringing all of our perspectives into these principles and how we view them, I think we contribute not only to the human, the economic sustainability of AI, impacts of AI, but also the cultural and the social. And we've always talked about Ubuntu. And when we talk about Ubuntu, we forget about the fact that they are women. And we forget about these feminist principles that can be included in Ubuntu. So from the West, yes, we want a philosophy, or we want policies and frameworks that are based on Ubuntu and communal and relational values, but those are not separated from feminist values. And somehow women are always lost in those conversations where we talk about Ubuntu and Ubuntu principles, for instance. I want to speak about an example of in Namibia, and we have, I think a lot of times when we talk about perspectives, we're also talking about participation. And so in the conservation sector, when they came up with these participation frameworks, they tied it to Ubuntu. And so they were like, okay, we're going to come into this constituency, and they are going to control govern the way that the shared resources are used within that constituency. And it is, okay, we're using Ubuntu. And then later on, they realized that the challenges that they have are only the men are benefiting in those communities from the use of those resources. And so we need to think about, when we adapt Ubuntu principles, how does the value, how is the value distributed, and how do we think about the harms that come from that? Sorry, Irene is nudging me on time. Very happy to discuss further.
Oh, okay. Right. I think you've just gone over a number of things that I just wanted to speak on as well. But I think just really building from, a number of things you've been going over in terms of just intersectionality, I think it's just important to highlight that, the need for, I feel, frameworks like this particular Afro-feminist governance framework is, recognizing that particularly groups like, say, African women are there is a whole number of areas, via which they are, structurally oppressed. And so you find that we look at, as an African woman, if, in your day-to-day interactions with, a number of, platforms where, obviously there is AI systems involved. As a Black woman, there is a number of, structural oppressions that, you're going to meet, being a woman as well, being, in terms of also your social, economic conditions. You find there is also a number of limitations in terms of access and usage, and even issues like, language, because we see, for example, language is a big issue in terms of, a lot of AI systems, because barely any African languages are, a part of a lot of the, NLP models that are being developed. And so, of course, that means there is marginalization in terms of, usage and access. So I think it's very important to just, to point out the need to look at the intersectional needs of a number of people, including African women, in developing AI systems and just their deployment across the continent, beyond just developing systems that are, that target, a universal user, because there is no such thing as a universal user. There is a number of people with different needs, and so there is a need to pay attention to these needs. And so I think also this just speaks to the, the rate at which a lot of AI systems are being developed is obviously very exponential. And so there is barely any, let's take care and, pay attention to the needs of different people, but it's just like, let's develop and go quicker and etc. And so I think there is just a need to pause and factor in the needs of all these different people, particularly African women here that we are proposing. And yeah, I think that'll be my contribution to that.
Thank you, Bobina and Kito, and I hope everyone is following. Those of you who are just joining us, thank you very much for joining us. This is the panel on Afro-feminist AI governance. And I'll go straight into our online team, and those of us who are joining us virtually, Yolanda. We are going to be speaking about power and not necessarily bias, to show you how power, the person who has power really is in charge of putting out the best systems, the best policies, and so forth. But over to you, Yolanda, and I hope you can hear me. Should AI or artificial intelligence challenges be approached as power issues and not just bias or so? For example, issues on practicality of artificial intelligence principles and frameworks, algorithmic aided disinformation, or hate speech. Over to you, Yolanda, and you have 7 minutes.
Sure, thanks so much, everyone, and for the previous remarks. And I'll save it for others, since I think there could be other perspectives for the panel on this. In terms of power dynamics that I'll bring expertise on before hearing from others, a crucial point I want to make that is core to the 3 national AI strategies that we worked on. Again, those are Rwanda, Ghana, and Tunisia, and which I know Smart Africa is taking seriously as well, is digital inclusion. So this is digital infrastructure like internet rollout, penetration, reliability, affordability and access to smartphones. Because once there are more people online, women, rural areas, lower income areas, then you get more diversity and inclusion, not just in who has access to AI, but crucially, whose data is being contributed via digital systems to AI. And that could limit bias. But it's very important because there's data collection challenges in a lot of the African countries. There's data shortages in all, it's data collection is such a major challenge even in the US, but particularly in regions where there's less digitized data, there's more paper records like in public sectors, and where there's fewer people online, including in demographic lines. So we have smart young people, graduates from computer science programs, develop using pre-trained models from the West, models trained on Western data, not as I think it was Babina mentioned, for example, in languages, not enough local language data, not enough local image data. So that's why digital infrastructure, digital inclusion is so important. And we can add to that AI literacy and digital literacy campaigns. So a couple of the countries have targeted programs specifically for women in AI and coding for AI. And this goes also to education reform and curricular reform to make sure that the number of women and also other demographics, including rural areas, are really included. So also when we recommend AI hubs or AI meetups, it shouldn't just be in the capital city. It should also be in other parts of the country, for example, and there should be ones targeting women. And so these are some, and along the lines of data as well, we'll also have as a core pillar in the national AI strategies, data sharing and data governance guidelines. So besides data governance, like for security and privacy, data protection commission or a key actor in the AI community can provide guidance on how to collect and share data responsibly. And this can facilitate data sharing so that we have more data and more representative data. But I'll go ahead and hand this over to others who want to speak more specifically on power dynamics, if there are any other views or questions on this.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. Because of time, I'll move on to the next set of questions, and then I'll be able to ask for the team who are checking online for any comments and questions, and then we'll take a few comments and questions in the room. But allow us to proceed, and Amber, this is for you. Are data justice ideals such as data ownership and meaningful consent data regimes in the current capitalistic data extravist global structures just that? Are they just ideals, or is there a way to realize their practicability?
So thanks, Irene. I think to begin with, we need to recognize the entrenched structural inequities that exist within the data economy. And I think when we talk about the primacy of data in governance debates in the recent past, perhaps there is no better indicator than the very, very hackneyed and overworked metaphors to describe it. So in the last few years, apart from data being likened to oil, it has been compared to mineral deposits. It has been compared to dividend deposits. It's been also compared to the Alaskan Permanent Fund. And on the other end of the spectrum, people have looked at the harmful impact of data processing. And people like Martin Tisney, for instance, have compared it to carbon dioxide. And others have compared its impact for harm to uranium and other pollutants. So when we have to think about confronting this structural inequity, then we must also try to figure out what the appropriate metaphor for data would be. So data ownership, for instance, is something that you mentioned, Irene, and that has a lot of intuitive power as a metaphor. But when we start likening data to property, or as a lot of policy documents across countries have fashioned data as an asset to be leveraged, the thing that we have to be careful about is that within the existing data economy, how it positions different set of actors. So in the way data exists right now, or the way data flows exist right now, the ownership rights to data are largely through non-negotiable one-sided contracts, are largely controlled by data processors and data controllers. Even if we were to reverse that trend, what we have to be careful about is to ensure that data ownership, even on part of data subjects, doesn't lead to outcomes which are exploitative. Because in the current market economy, what that might end up meaning is that data will just position itself more and more as a tradable asset, and people who are more disadvantaged will actually get a worse deal for their data. The other way to look at data perhaps could be data as labor, where data is a very clear manifestation of the labor put in by those who are involved in the generation of data, people who are participants in processes which lead to the generation of that data. And but there also, I think, when we start fashioning data as labor, we have to be careful in terms of what kind of labor value is attached to different demographics. So somebody who consumes data, more, let's say, luxurious products, and is part of a better off demographic, there will be more advertising interest in their data. So how we assign value to the labor in that data is important. So according to me, I think perhaps the best way to fashion data is to think of a metaphor around autonomy. So I think going back to what you were talking about Ubuntu earlier and the rights of collectives. And autonomy also can exist at various levels. It can exist at individual as well as collective levels. And I think sort of looking at data as something that arises from people's bodies and the ways in which it compromises individual choice and autonomy, I think centering that part of the conversation is important. And that's not something that in a lot of debates around data is happening. So, and there are various pieces, since you spoke about practicality, Irene, there are various pieces to that conversation. At the first level, we need to conceptually agree that something like decisional autonomy can be an appropriate metaphor for data. And then we need to look at ways in which that can be realized. So collectives which represent identity-based interests could be one way to do that. And that could, in a very direct way, confront the power dynamics at play, because individuals are often not in a position to exercise that sort of power. Then looking at how collective choice versus individual choice needs to be balanced out, and perhaps in cases of conflict, we have to be very clear that we privilege individual choice and individual autonomy over an overbearing collective interest. So those are pieces of conversation that need to happen, and what we need is more workable models, a few collective experiments that try to realize that vision of data. I'll pause there.
Wow, thank you very much, Yolanda and Amber. Just before I proceed to Bridget, I just picked something very strong from the last two speakers. And one is the metaphors that we use. We tweet, we write articles, we write academic papers. We start off, data is the new mineral. Data is the new oil. We need to be quite careful, because if we position this way, then we continue to disadvantage those who are never able to afford those minerals in the first place. And just, just to jump to Bridget, I'll go straight to Bridget because we have other questions, and just ask you direct. Bridget, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll just jump straight to you and ask, how can governments be empowered in terms of artificial intelligence oversight responsibility?
Thank you for that question, Irene. And it's one that's really at our core at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where we do two main things, which is public policy and government advisory. And literally every day our question is, how do we help governments to deliver for their citizens? The other reason why I also really like this question is because it allows us to humanize governments and policymakers a bit by thinking about what we can do to support them in their work. I think sometimes, especially in technology, we tend to sort of give this overarching power to governments where we can do a lot to support them in thinking about how they deliver the AI future that we all want. So in terms of this question, and how we empower governments to actually deliver on this and to use AI responsibly, including oversight, we think about it in two ways. And we recently published a report where I would invite everyone to read if you're interested in learning more about this. But I think the first way is to support governments in really understanding the opportunity available to them through AI, and then to help them to test and adopt the technology responsibly. We say this because of two primary reasons. One, it is really difficult to regulate or have oversight over something that you don't understand. So we think there's a tremendous opportunity to educate policymakers and governments on AI. And, an example I like to give this from this year is we've seen some of the oversight hearings around technology harms, et cetera. And it's really clear that some of our policymakers in Africa and around the world don't really understand what AI is. And it would be easy to ridicule this fact. But I think instead we have, for such a broad and fast moving technologies such as AI, we have an opportunity to bring folks from policy, the future society, industry together to provide trainings and workshops that really helps policymakers to understand what the technology is, its harms, and its benefits as well. I think the other reason why it's important to educate policymakers in this regard, as a step towards empowering them, is that there's a true value in having policymakers understand how they can use the technology responsibly to deliver effective digital applications and citizens systems for their citizens. I think Yolanda, Keto, Amber, everyone has talked about some of the concerns that we have here. But there's through the concerns, there's a clear opportunity that that presents itself, and policymakers can take advantage of if they understand, if they understand what the technology is able to do, especially within its current context and constraints, as opposed to sort of within the hype of what AI is. The second reason we really believe in empowering policymakers and taking sort of this facade away from who they are and what they do is, I think that there's an opportunity to provide frameworks, which is what we really appreciate about the work Pollicy does. We don't only talk about educating policymakers, but we provide tools for them to be able to do their work well. So in our recent report, we cite that responsible AI is really key for policymakers to enable the transformation we want to see in the public sector. It's also key for foreign direct investment, as well as in assisting talent attraction and retention. And the idea that responsible AI has clear dividends needs to continue to be shared and developed. And the tools that we provide, from Afro-feminist AI frameworks to some of the tools we have in our toolkit, continue to empower governments to think about AI more holistically, to think about some of the issues of digital inclusion, ethics, and procurement, et cetera, that I think we've discussed on the panel. So again, thank you for the question, Irene. I think to sum it up, we need to take away the mysticism around who politicians are, who governments are. We need to understand that they can be supported, they can be empowered through the work that we do, all of us do on in our respective spaces, and that education is really at the key of advancing the issue of oversight and responsible governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bridget and I are literally almost the same person, quite passionate about political and government engagement. And I'd like to request all of you, you have to find ways to continue engaging your local government elected officials beyond your national level elected officials in the AI and technology discourse. But I had to interchange questions because I thought the next question will need more time. And it's based on the first question that we asked in this room on how many of you have attended sessions this year on AI, on artificial intelligence, and you've had a woman on the panel speaking, or an African woman being an expert on AI speaking. And we asked that right when we began, and those who joined us, I hope you're able to interact with that question and think about it for your 2022 and for your future work, to continue to invite African women to speak on your AI panels and engage in your artificial intelligence work. But Bobina and then Kito, techno-chauvinism is becoming more evident in a number of AI for development programs. We know why this happens in the global south under the pretext of progress. How can we foster safer artificial intelligence or AI development and deployment that does not violate fundamental human fundamental human rights and dignity. Welcome, Bobina.
Thank you, Irene. So first of all, I just want to start off by just pointing out that even as we're getting into the conversation about techno-chauvinism and just its, effects, we are cognizant of, the potential that AI and data holds for the continent and for African women as a demographic. And so what we would like is for this potential to be able to realize in terms of it being actually beneficial to this group. However, with just techno-chauvinism is just really this outlook on tech, this approach where we look at tech as a fix to all our problems, and it's becoming it's a phenomenon that's obviously global, not just on the African continent, but on the African continent is more prevalent, especially because a lot of technological progress is easily just looked at as advancement, as its development, and so we just will go with anything that's being brought onto the continent, and particularly here in terms of AI systems that are being developed and deployed across the continent. And so what we're saying is there is need to look at the harms that these technologies are posing, and because research and a number of studies have showed that there is a number of harms that are coming with a number of technologies that are being deployed, particularly in a number of AI for development programs. So we've seen with like a number of poverty programs on the continent, which have ended up being where we see surveillance, mass surveillance, because they're saying, oh, we're watching the progress of a number of villages and communities, but what we see is active surveillance of citizens, and that's a violation of their privacy and their dignity as human beings. And so we see people's humanity is basically being attacked fundamentally, and this crosses over to a number of things where AI is being deployed in. We've seen with the biometric systems of identification, and a number of people cannot access a number of services, the IDs and passport. And of course, again, this goes back to our initial discussion around intersectionality and looking at how a number of these issues particularly affect African women who are living at the margins of society. And so we're just saying there is a need to look at to move away from looking at any tech that's coming onto the continent as progress, as advancement, as development, and rather question, how does this work for the continent? How does this work for the population, African women, and just the continent as a whole? Yeah.
I have to agree with Bobina there, and just add further that I think as well in framing tech as always progressive, and how we think about ethical action is a question of how do we understand ethical action, and also like the social constraints that impact that ethical action. From a big tech or startup perspective, I think what is a way that we can come up with AI technologies AI technologies that do not violate fundamental human rights is in diversifying how we think about ethical action. In terms of tech startups, I think sometimes the go-to actions are in diversity hiring, for instance, or talking about race, or more data, data mining and extracting. So I think always bring up those constraints. Like sometimes, even though we want to have ethical AI, and we want to build technology based on ethical principles, but what is our understanding of that, and how do people coming into communities on the continent within the global majority, how do they understand the social dynamics that impact how we conceptualize ethics? Another one, and I think also in how we think about consent. Is consent ticking on, in a computer saying, I consent to these cookies, or I accept these cookies, or I give you my consent to use this technology, my data for this technology. So in diversifying as well how we think about consent. Another one is in my opinion, very important, and Bobina alluded to this, the investment in or the balancing of how we prioritize policy interests. Yes, we've seen many people talk about AI for energy. We don't have energy. I've lived in South Africa. We've gone 8 hours without energy. How are we going to power a cloud, systems? Like, those are like true things. Are we going to divert the conversation or the policy conversation away from like building energy infrastructure to AI? So thinking very critically about how, what investments we're making, and at what expense are we foregoing other policy interests for the intention of developing AI technologies. And I think as well as when we talk, people when we talk about AI for good or tech for good, the for good is always at the end of the technology. We don't think about what happens in that process or the life cycle of that development of that technology. So thinking at every stage when data is mined, who is harmed, what are the harms there? At design, what are the potential harms and risks? And at deployment, thinking about all the risks at that stage, as opposed to what we do normally of being like, okay, this is good. It is, a technology for, I've seen one on seeing or tracking how, seeing which kind of clients, HIV patients, come back, are most likely not to come back for their treatment, which is like, okay, we want to like see the behavior, but what does that do in terms of how those people come back, and like how we stereotype who doesn't come back for treatment, and how we see this pandemics. Yes, maybe it might be good. Actually, it's not very good, but it's causing more harm at other stages before that final stage. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much. You've touched on, Bobina and Kito, you've touched on very, very challenging issues that continue to ail the development discourse. And it's for everyone in the room really to find ways to better address these challenges so that tomorrow things can be better and the environments we work in can be better. I'd like to go to the next question, and then if anyone online and in the room have questions or comments, prepare yourself, and then we'll be able to take questions. So Yolanda, over to you, and then Amber and Bridget, maybe with your contributions. How do you believe data protection and governance could be made more effective on the continent and global south, generally, considering what is happening currently? And Yolanda, you have already alluded to the fact that you've supported the governments of Rwanda, Ghana, and Tunisia. Maybe you can also share some of the learnings from those countries that other countries can emulate or can consider while they prepare their AI strategies. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So this point is about capacity building for government to enforce data governance as well. And it doesn't need to be direct, it doesn't need to be regulation, it could just be providing guidance, for example, for AI developers and the technical community, like on appropriate local ethical guidelines, data sharing in a ethical way, preserving privacy, et cetera, cybersecurity, data collection to make it more inclusive and representative, et cetera. So when we talk about AI policy, we don't just mean regulatory, but we could be equipping the community. So I mentioned 3 pillars earlier that are key to enable the AI ecosystem in a way that supports inclusion. And those were human education policy, inclusive education policy, digital infrastructure and digital inclusion, and data sharing and data governance. So these are 3 pillars that are common in the 3 national AI strategies, which we supported in Africa. But there's 3 or 4 more, and those are targeting AI adoption in key sectors in the private sector. The next pillar is targeting AI adoption in the public sector, including capacity building for policymakers. And then other pillars usually include ethical guidelines, supporting the AI community, or scientific research. And Tony Blair Institute, as Bridget mentioned, is doing a lot of great leadership on capacity building for government and policymakers. I shared in the chat a report as well on AI for policymakers by GIZ. And there with Smart Africa, there's also trainings going on for policymakers. But I think also, as Bridget mentioned, we need to equip and support public sector to be able to enforce data privacy, because often countries have data privacy guidelines, but they might not have the capacity to enforce them, and cybersecurity as well, which is extremely, extremely important as we have more digital devices and they're not secured. So private sector might not be across countries aware or incentivized enough to uphold data privacy, cybersecurity, ethical guidelines, representation, accountability, transparency, and so many issues. So that's where capacity building and training for public sector is so important in providing, as mentioned, guidelines on data sharing or tools for trustworthy AI. So there's also the OECD AI Policy Observatory, in which I'm an expert as well, has a toolkit for trustworthy AI frameworks. So they have a database, this is OECD.ai, where people could, all over developers, so this could be disseminated to developers, can find kind of assessment tools and guidelines that they can use directly, as well as following ethical principles, which could be adapted for local use. And of course, we want these to be adapted locally, because so many, as mentioned in the first question, ethical guidelines as well as AI policies are developed in the North, but they are used and adopted in Africa. It may be directly, for example, governments we work with that would like to use as a starting point the EU AI ethical guidelines or OECD ones, or de facto, for example, when people use AI models pre-trained on Western data. I mean, another core recommendation for the public sector is a responsible AI office, but often governments don't have the resources for that. But having an in-house coordinating body that's mandated to be able to coordinate across different ministries is really important as well. And we see that in the UK, in Singapore, in Egypt as well.
Thanks, Yolanda. I don't know if I can come in here on one point, Irene. Awesome. Yolanda, I couldn't say more on the regulatory and non-regulatory sort of examples that you've set out for how we improve and continue to support data governance and policies on the continent. I think the other bit that we've seen in our work at the Institute that is worth mentioning is in regards to what diversity of policymakers does for more effective governance. So when I started this role in early 2020, we had about 28 of 54 African countries with data protection laws. And about 15 of those countries had data protection authorities to enforce those laws. As at the start of this year, it looks like the number from some of our research, the number has increased to about 33 countries on the continent now have data protection laws. And there are about 18 data protection authorities. And we've seen governments have appointed a record number of women to these positions. Women make about 45% of these appointments to data protection commissioners. So I think this is a really cool place where we see the intersection of sort of gender, feminism, and governance, whereby when we have African women at the helm, leading, supporting the work of effective technology governance, effective AI governance, we see more activity in the space. We have more data protection laws. There's so many constraints, but I just wanted to take a minute to applaud the work that a lot of the ministers of ICT and data protection are doing in terms of providing those regulatory guidelines, providing those non-regulatory supports, whether it's self-assessment, industry guidelines, and things like that. And a lot of the women ministers that we speak to are also doing a great job of bringing more exposure and public education to young girls and women as it relates to the field. So again, I wholeheartedly support Yolanda's points around, the enforcement. I mean, we can't stress that enough. There are laws, but we know that we need more funding across the continent to support governments with enforcing these data protection policies. But I think it's a tremendous feat that we have more women pushing to get more regulatory and non-regulatory tools to do the work that hopefully is more inclusive and more responsible than we would have otherwise. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to kind of take off from what Bridget was talking about earlier in terms of the emergence of data protection law and various data protection authorities in the continent. And I think that's the key piece, because you have emerging regulators entering into a space which before that existed very much in a state of regulatory vacuum. So the challenge for these regulators is to move very quickly from a state of fairly minimal or primitive data practices to a set of robust data governance ecosystem. And I think and again, we're talking about jurisdictions where often there may be a capacity challenge, there is a resource and funding challenge as well. So one of the things perhaps that needs more attention is how regulation and particularly the enforcement of regulation can be smart. And there, I think for countries who are kind of, for lack of a better word, arriving late to the party, there is the advantage of foresight in terms of about 20 to 30 years of enforcement practices in other parts of the world. So for instance, there are strategies which have worked or have not worked in other parts of the world. So for instance, use of the trust model in a country like Japan, or the use of very high monetary penalties by the UK to convince, or use that threat to convince companies to enter into enforcement contracts, or for instance, the sort of gradual move from hard power to soft power in a place like Spain, or in the US, where the FTC has largely regulated by making an example out of large players. So the key thing when you are operating in a state of sort of limited capacity and sort of small government in that sense is to then draw from these learnings and see what can be applied in the local context. And I think that conversation perhaps needs to happen much more.
Thank you very much. And everyone, Yolanda, Bridget, and Amber have been speaking on the use and importance of the Data Protection Acts or policies and the authorities in countries. And of course, since we are the IGF, we all know some of the countries that are yet to begin these processes or are in the process of putting this in place. Maybe it's also a clarion call for every actor in this room to find ways to engage in the discourse back in your countries, to push our governments to develop this quite, rapidly, so that they can be used by both public and private sectors to seek different justice that they would need. And then going to our kind of final questions, and we have one for the audience as well, so you can start preparing your responses. And I'll start with, let me see, who haven't I heard from the most? I think Bridget, I'll start with you. Sorry to put you on the spot. Considering the opacity of majority of the AI systems, how can a climate of trust around artificial intelligence development and deployment in the global south be realized? I know you had already alluded to some of that, but you can speak to these with a vision of women, African women and girls in mind. Thank you. And then Yolanda, and then my team here on the stage.
Thanks, Irene. And again, it's wonderful to be on such an esteemed panel, because I know I can't mention or won't be able to mention all of the tremendous initiatives that are ongoing to do this. But I'll just speak to it from our perspective in terms of where we see, what governments in particular can do in building trust in AI. So at the beginning of the year, we actually published a report on trust in technology, specifically AI, where we looked at a number of countries, including countries in Africa, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya were the four that we looked at on the continent, and asked questions around how people saw acceptance on various AI use cases. What we saw was that generally in the global South, emerging markets, as well as the African countries that I mentioned, there was a higher level of acceptance for various AI use cases than in more developed markets in let's say, the global North. And specifically, people saw AI as an opportunity to improve welfare distribution, to improve health outcomes, and to improve agriculture, et cetera. I certainly agree with Keto's point on definitely taking keen of, not overselling the hype of what the technology can do. But I think what we came away from with the research was that in the global South in Africa, there's generally a perception that, because of some of the constraints we have around resources, that technology can help us, as Bobina also mentioned, can help us to address some of the many challenges we have around delivering more equitably for everyone. So in terms of building trust, I provide that context to say that, one, in the global South, we do see that there is some level of trust. It's not tremendously high. It's not 90% as we would like, but it's much higher than we have in other places. And we can build on top of the trust that is there by, one, not overselling what the technology can do. I can't say that enough from where I sit. Two, we need to promote public knowledge about the technology and specifically celebrate and build on positive use cases. We've seen a number of positive examples coming out of places like Ghana, Kenya, et cetera, around smart agriculture, around smart healthcare, that I think we can do more to disseminate its benefits to a larger population, as opposed to, as Yolanda referred to earlier, just, let's say, the urban centers or just a small tech crowd in many African countries. In Ghana, where I sit, it's typically a small group of people who consistently get this information. So how can we make sure that there's more public knowledge, in diverse languages for women that are relevant in the local context that we can share? I think the other thing is we need to build, in terms of building trust, we've all mentioned to a certain extent the fact that a lot of the AI technologies in Africa, especially those that are currently being deployed by governments, are actually are actually imported to the continent. And I think earlier this year, there was an MIT review report on surveillance technologies in Southern Africa that was really sort of scary in terms of what's going on and when we have these technologies being brought in from outside. So I think the last thing I'll say here, and I know there are many more that our panelists will add, but the last thing I'll say here is that it's important that we work on international cooperation on trust in AI, because the technologies in Africa are not only from Africa. They're not primarily being developed by only African developers. So if we can't build a global conversation where the global South Africans have a seat at the table around what responsible ethical AI looks like, then we'll continue to get these imported technologies that don't promote that trust, that are not effective and eventually don't promote the trust that we need to see in the technology. So I'll stop there, but overall, we think there's a lot more government can do in terms of facilitating trust. But we think there's a tremendous opportunity given the climate and what people want to see from their governments, what they want to see delivered on the continent, and what they think technology can do more generally. Thanks, Irene. Back over to you.
I'm just confirming if my time was to end at 10:30 or 11. I know it's 11. Pardon? Yes, 11. So, Yolanda, I'll bounce the question again to you to speak for a few minutes, and then my panelists here with me, and I have one general question for the audience. So, let's spend the next 15 minutes reflecting on that.
Thank you. I'll amplify Bridget's points, which were brought in, all very important and on point. So the Future Society's mission is to align AI through better governance. It's not just to promote AI adoption, right? It's to promote responsible, inclusive, sustainable AI adoption. And as Bridget mentioned, many countries in the global south have a lot more enthusiasm for innovation and less mistrust or precaution, as in Europe, for example. So there tends to be more of a culture of this will help us in education, this will help us in agriculture, this will help us in transport, without having done enough tests or preparing precautions in terms of ethics and safety and security. For example, if we're going to use AI in the classroom, we're using AI on children, and AI systems fail and have problems. I mean, there are many other failures mentioned. So ethics by design, safety, privacy, security, testing, human-centered design. So there's this, Stanford University has a center on human-centered design, which is all about making sure that it works for the person, are critical. And another critical point, as Bridget mentioned, increasing public knowledge. When we have more public knowledge and AI literacy and digital literacy in the community, then the community can hold AI companies, developers, and regulators to account, and can support AI governance by providing feedback, social media in their use, in feedback to government, and saying, hey, this isn't okay, this is a failure, right? Because they know, for example, this can be fixed through more testing and controls and representative data sets. And so we could also build trust. I'll just put a last plug by referring to examples, for example, risk management frameworks by NIST and OECD, and I pasted that in the chat, which have a collection of tools. Of course, these should be developed locally as well. And so I'll stop there and see if others have key points.
Thank you. I start with you, Bobina.
Okay. Cool. In the interest of time, I think I'll just go over what I wanted to point out very quickly. I think one of the things, I think there is a number of things that could just be considered in terms of creating a climate of trust in AI development and deployment on the continent. But I think one of them is just accountability, and I think that has got to be buttressed across the entire ecosystem, from the developers to the governments that are, buying and deploying this, or even just developing the systems of the continent. Because where harm arises, we should be able to trace it and be able to address it directly. And because we know a lot of AI models are really just functioning sort of black box models, and so I think accountability is one of the things that we could definitely look to a climate of trust.
Yeah, I think in this sense, I would want to say that I see opacity as an opportunity in the sense that oftentimes we look at the harms at the end. We say, okay, these are the risks, but maybe we could ask the questions, like if we don't understand what we don't understand about a certain AI system, and if we ask ourselves questions of like legitimate aim, for instance, and proportionality, if we don't have an answer to that, then we should build in frameworks or policy frameworks and safeguards to answer those questions. So what we don't understand about AI, we have to develop policies for them, or governance frameworks for those questions. And I also think that we are at an advantage in terms of what Amber said about learning from other countries, but also learning from cross sectors. Earlier this year, we did a study at Research ICT Africa where we looked at AI use in Southern Africa. And one of the things that we did was really trying to kind of come up with a taxonomy of how the kind of AI that is present in the region, and in identifying that, okay, it is, functional, or it is text-based, or it is analysis. In understanding that, we came to the realization that there's a silo of like different sectors. So they are within different sectors in Southern Africa. People have been thinking about technology and how it is applied in those sectors. And we've seen that, okay, we can take from the conservation sector, we can take from the health. And there have been, there are learnings and kind of like, learnings that each of those sectors can bring to the table in developing national AI systems. Another one is just to, I think, in understanding that we don't understand how AI systems work, we should also have this thinking that a lack of evidence of harm is not a lack of, is not the same as the evidence of lack of harm. Mm-hmm. So just because we don't, we don't see the harm doesn't mean it's not there, and that doesn't mean that we should not come up with the safeguards to protect human dignity and human rights. And I'll stop there.
I'll just sort of add to what has been said so far. I think in terms of the opacity problem that we face, in the last few years, there's almost been an explosion of literature from the field of explainable AI or XAI. But I think what has also happened as a result is that there isn't a lot of consensus on what a lot of those concepts even mean. And what we run the risk of creating a lot of models without very clear ideas on how they may be implemented. So I think what we need to do is to also center the need for meaningful transparency, which can actually foster accountability. So we need to reframe the idea of transparency in some ways, because in most situations it doesn't lead to the kind of accountability that it seeks to achieve. And particularly in the context of AI, obviously, the fact that we deal with opaque algorithmic systems, that complicates the landscape even further. And perhaps what we do need is not even complete transparency about the system, but enough transparency so that users who deal with them can form a conceptual model of what they're working with. And that might be enough to start the process of accountability. So I think with that, I'll pause.
Thank you very much. Are you still with us? Because we have a question for you. I know the questions may be not in the sequence that we all would hope for, but we had 90 minutes to make sure we cover how African women engage with AI and how governments can do better. But we'd like to pose this question to you, maybe as even we walk out, because time is not on our side, and also to reflect on the role, because I know there are journalists in the room, I know there are government officials in the room, I know there are students in the room, I know there are mainstream civil society actors and human rights actors and defenders in the room. So who are the key stakeholders that should be involved in the artificial intelligence or AI ethics discourse, and why? And how can they all be engaged in the conversation meaningfully? Maybe by show of hands, if you want to come in and share, there's a mic in front of you, you can just switch it on. Anyone? Anyway, I'll start us off by saying, and this is something that I'm quite passionate about, is to talk about how journalists, both broadcast and, both legacy and alternative media or journalists can be able to bring on this conversation closer to home. You all watch your news now either on your phone, your digital devices, or on your television sets or on your radios. And based on all the news that you hear, I can guarantee you the word AI or artificial intelligence on our African media is rarely talked about. So the power that journalists and community reporters have is to promote this topic, is to promote this debate, and to start talking about these issues so that our communities at the local government level can start picking on this. And then as human rights defenders who are here in the room, who don't ordinarily maybe speak or engage in technology work or artificial intelligence, is for you to keenly conduct human rights-based assessments on some of the policies that are coming up on different technology models. That's on the data protection, the AI policy frameworks coming about being developed in conjunction with some of the civic tech communities, and to look at the human rights, when you conduct the human rights assessments, you'll be able to see where you need to ask governments and other stakeholders to put emphasis on inclusion, put emphasis on promoting good technology as opposed to tech for good, as Kito has said, and also really promote the hierarchy of needs, because at the end of the day, we know that there's a hierarchy of needs also, as Kito and other panelists tried to share before, because you cannot put development of AI models when you do not even have power powering on in your countries. So it's quite important that as different actors in this room who feel that AI is far off from our main day-to-day work or our strategies, it's important for you to start considering, because it's here to stay, and we need models that work for us and are by us as Africans. And on that note, because of time, I'd like to thank everyone who has contributed today, Yolanda, Bridget, and everyone who has joined us online. Thank you very much. I'd like to request that you check our social media handles. We'll be sharing some of the resources that the Future Society has shared, and Tony Blair Institute, and some of the other resources that Pollicy and Research RIA Africa already have. We'd also like to request that you find us outside and engage with us, so that we can be able to share with you additional information that we had based on this panel. And we thank you all for coming here today, and thank you for joining us online. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and let's talk soon. Bye.
Thank you, Irene. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
I forgot to ask if you have any questions. Yeah, I'm sorry. But yeah, I can see one already. Yeah, you can, yes, let me switch off.
Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Eugenio Gagliardone. I'm based at Wits University in Johannesburg. So actually I have two questions, if we can stay a bit longer. And first of all, thank you for putting this perspective together. It's refreshing, it's empowering, it's different, so it's great. So my first question is, some of the most visible work on race and gender is focused on the US. If we think of the work of Joy Blomini and Timnit Gebru, they also have roots in Africa, but how do you engage with that kind of literature? Because race and gender relationship in the United States are different from Namibia, South Africa, India, and so forth. Because sometimes the US doesn't get Africa, and how do you critically make use of this work, but at the same time make sure that it's rooted where we live? And the second question, it might be a bit strange, but I try to make it more precise. Does Afrofuturist perspective has anything to say, for example, on internet fragmentation? I'm pretty sure that that room on the other side is pretty packed. It seems it's the session of this IGF. And I know that you discussed about AI, but the two things are related. Let me give you an example. 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of fuzz about the project that a facial recognition company called CloudWalk signed in Zimbabwe. And the problem was, is it going to be like massive surveillance of everyone, or is CloudWalk wants to train its facial recognition software to recognize African faces? And whose data is this? Is the data of the government of Zimbabwe, or is it belongs to CloudWalk? And the point is, maybe the Afrofuturist framework doesn't have a perspective on internet fragmentation, but it would be great if it did. Because one, it will bring something new, as we saw today, rather than China is this position, Singapore is this position, the US is this position. And the second point is what you focused on is incredibly important, but I also see somehow a risk to self-marginalize. We focus on the margins, we don't focus on the big questions, but maybe there is something new that we will all benefit from if we use that specific framework.
Any other question? I don't want to miss you out. Yes, 1, 2. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Oh, okay. So
no, I'm from India, and thank you, Amber, for being here. I think you put little perspective on. But I think the idea of Africa and in terms of simplicity of simple data inclusion is totally missing, right? So to begin with, I think I'm a little bit of a pessimist in sense, even these big AI models, whatever you call them, they have to take a step back. We can come to these conversations only when we have the data inclusion. If the data inclusion is not happening, I think this conversation is basically baseless. The second point, actually, the whole number of panelists brought in were also, I think the idea of explainability will only come to sense when we have a credible number of ML and AI engineers in Africa and in the global south, whatever you call it. The XAI is still only for ML AI engineers. It does not really explain to people like public policy makers or bureaucrats or anything else. So I think these two fundamental components, when they are missing, you really cannot progress in this sense of direction of, how inclusion of, global south in general, I would say, Africa, South Asia, whatever, can come to place. Thank you. Just a comment. It's not. I don't require a response. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Wasn't she in my front? I guess. I think she was.
Thank you so much for this panel. This really gives me so much empowerment and so much energy to continue advocating for Afrofeminism in a technological context. It was really inspiring, and I would love to see more of such panels for sure. I was asking myself, because you talked specifically about the structural oppression of African women and techno-chauvinism, how do you think colonial continuities play a role there in AI policy, and what can be done to also in a way decolonize these processes, especially in a development context?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the panel. It was amazing. I have two main questions. The first, and they're quite more practical on the advocacy level. So I think that Bridget brought very interesting points regarding how to communicate with governments about these issues, and policymakers put them so to say on our side, think responsible, ethical ways of using technology. But I would like to know if you guys have specific experiences to share about this. And just to give an example, I'm from Brazil, and we have conducted some research in South America about the deployment of facial recognition systems, and tech chauvinism, tech solutionism is all around the dialogues we had with, for instance, in the field of public security with police officers and so on. So how do you guys deal with it, especially with most of the time professionals who are not that used to a human rights discourse and so on? So it would be lovely to hear if you guys have experiences. The other question relates to also a point that you guys brought about how to bring information and build capacity to help people understand how the systems work, in order also to, and Bridget talked about good examples and so on. But I was also interested in what are your thoughts on bringing meaningful transparency using Amber's words, so as also to empower them to question this technology, especially when they have negative outcomes toward the individuals themselves. And finally, very practical, if if Bridget could also share the study that she mentioned about Egypt and Kenya. There were I can't remember all of the countries. But yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, there's another. Okay.
our time is up, so we keep it short.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi. It's such a great panel discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I know some of you personally and work with you. Yeah, it's great to be here. I guess my question is: there is like a rich literature within Africa that has outlined various theories of Afrofeminism. For example, Sylvia Tamale, the amazing Ugandan scholar, Wangari Maathai, they have all written about Afrofeminism, African feminism from the perspectives and from the realities of African women. So as we are talking about Afrofeminism and governance, how can we incorporate their works into the governance and policy space? Because I'm sure you all agree their work is critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the insightful questions. I think we're also going to think a lot about them and going to inform our work. I'm just going to answer one question which is tied to Abeba's, but also the gentleman who spoke first, on how critical feminist theories from the West and from North America intersect with those from the continent. And I think that question is, in a way, and I say this very politely, a question that is weaponized against us as Africans, where, your second question was about how do we, view our frameworks and policies as part of the global community. And feminist discourse also, the discourse, Afrofeminism doesn't exist outside of how race and feminism is constructed in America or elsewhere. I think our different perspectives, they all come together, they're all like intersectional, and they all in some way work together, and they inform the way that we view, and should in a way inform the way that we develop and design AI policies and frameworks. And I think as well on the how we can action Afrofeminist theories, I think it's a lot of times, like, I think the work, most of the work in terms of like feminism is offline. The kind of like patriarchal thinkings that we have and that we, inject into the policies and into the frameworks that we, and government frameworks that we design. The African Union data policy framework, for instance, we have a section in there on data justice. And I think when we think about justice, we also think about social data justice. We think about incorporating the different perspectives, but also how do we break down how we conceptualize data governance? Like, how do we think about participation, or like the different communities that we want to impact, or that we want to be impacted by data governance frameworks. And so it's influencing. Essentially, I want to say it's about participation. It's about also our epistemic understandings of issues. And yeah, I really strongly think that most of the work is not related to technology or AI per se. It's in how we think about these issues, and how when we're in a room, when people speak, who are we listening to? Who is allowed to be creative and who is not allowed to be creative? Who is harmed and who is not harmed, and so forth. It's just, it's all those issues that are not part of technology per se. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
I'll try and be very quick because we're out of time. I will start with your question. I'll say a lot of the scholars around Afrofeminism, Sylvia Tamale herself, are people that guide a lot of the work that we do, say with Pollicy, and just I know with a lot of our partners doing similar work. And so I'd say a lot of their theory, etc., is very incorporated in almost everything we do. It's a blueprint. There isn't so much scholarly work around Afrofeminism, and so what is there guides a lot of what we do in academic writing, etc. And that just, I'll cross over to her question as well around coloniality and etc. with these technologies. We point it out in this particular framework, how we see, neo-colonialism with say, data extractivist practices ongoing on the continent, and we address those, as neo-colonialism and imperialism, and we call it out as such. And, as per, you say, what can be done about that? I think it's from discussions from these and whatnot that we're able to come up with to build up a number of those. But a number of things, obviously, we've suggested are, say, she mentioned creative, and that's something that's very important to us, because we talk about coming up with, creative and new ways of thinking around, say, if it's, data collection, data analysis, and just overall all the practices around AI development and deployment across the continent that fit in with our ways of thinking, and not with, say, the hegemonic, objective, neutral, ways of thinking. And so bringing in our new ways of thinking, which are Afrofeminism right now, and that guiding our thinking around our work. Yeah, I'm happy to have, this conversation with you outside the room.
I think I'll just, most of what was asked was perhaps covered by these two responses. I just wanted to cover a couple of quick things. I think there was a question earlier about dealing with professionals who are not quite steeped in the human rights discourse. And I think Kito made a very good point earlier during the session about policy objectives and hierarchy of policy objectives. So a lot of times I think that sort of efficiency language perhaps speaks to stakeholders who may not be as conversant or sympathetic to the human rights discourse. And I also feel that the efficiency language actually is not used enough sometimes, because often when we talk about these technological models, they are created in a very sort of Western Caucasian context, and they are largely, without too much thought, extrapolated and adopted in other contexts, and they don't really work in those contexts. So I think a lot of focus on also demonstrating how they don't work could be quite useful in those conversations. And I think on Afrofeminism and race and gender, I think we covered that in a fair bit of detail. I think I just wanted to add, I think also bringing in my own context from India a little bit there. I think centering the anti-colonialism in that conversation perhaps becomes very important. And a lot of technological adoption that we see, right from things like digital identity to facial recognition software is very much repurposing a lot of colonial technologies that we've seen being imposed for several, for some centuries now. So I do think, and then I completely agree with what Abeba said, that it's very important to ensure that historical context is always at the background of these conversations, and we need to work harder to sort of bring them in. Yeah, thank you.
Bridget, I'd like to give you a minute, and yes, we've not deserted you. Do you have something maybe to share?
Yes, just very briefly to add on to Amber's comments around communicating with policymakers. I certainly agree that one of the things we've seen in speaking about human rights-centered AI, which we call responsible AI, but at the heart of it, it's really about centering people and their needs first, is that we need to communicate the social and economic benefits for policymakers. We can't stress that enough. And I think in the private sector, there's a lot of work being done around how responsible companies perform better on even stock indexes and things like that. But that's not being translated into the public sector. How do we quantify and help policymakers really understand the benefits and actually the tremendous opportunity that human-centered AI or responsible AI affords everyone in being able to kind of have more effective technologies generally. And then the second point, just briefly on decolonial AI, I think there's tremendous work being done by, Amber also mentioned Abiba Berhane, there's Sabelo Mbale, and I may be pronouncing his last name incorrectly, in Lobby, I think, at Harvard, who talk about this. And I think a lot of what we discuss actually plays a role in this. When we talk about decolonial AI, it's about investigating power, especially power that's coming from a lot of the foreign companies who own the data that then decide a lot of the ways in which we interact with AI. So I think an investigation of power and the distribution of resources, as well as the historical context, is really key to advancing the conversation further. But I've learned so much from the questions as well, and thanks everyone for adding in.
Thank you so much, everyone. And this is an official goodbye because we've spent over 15 minutes of our time slot. But as you can tell, it's a very much needed discourse. We'd like to invite all of you to follow us on our Twitter and go on our website and see some of the work that we've put about this topic. And we are Pollicy with double L. You should be able to find us. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience, and we can network outside.